Welcome back to Taiwan versus the world. Today we will talk about a topic frequently mentioned in discussions about a potential military action by China against Taiwan, the role played by criminal gangs. You've probably heard it before that they could help China and that they are linked to temples. This borders on a trope and we like nothing more than challenging preconceived ideas. So we will talk with two people who research the topic and learn what is actually true. Then we will make a brief stop in Honolulu to talk about the Defense Forum, where two attendees will tell us what the event was about. And now, let's start with our interviews. We are going to drift away a bit from geopolitics into Godfather territory today, but it seems like it's not very far away, at least as far as East Asia is concerned. There's always a bit of implication between crime and politics. And here are two men who actually challenge that when it comes to Taiwan, or at least temper it. So we are going to move away from cliches and learn a bit more. Today with me are Ben, Sando and Jacob Tischer. Gentlemen, hello.
Hi.
Hello there.
If I can ask both of you to introduce yourself, maybe Ben first, and you can introduce us to Jacob.
Yes, hi, Julian. I've been on the show before, and it was a pleasure last year to talk about Taiwan's gangs and the connection to politics and the landscape of potential Chinese influence as well. There's been some research findings since then, but I sort of owe it all to Jacob because he wrote this foundational paper on this exact topic several years ago. And I'm so happy to be joined by him today.
So actually, I can pass this on further. So thank you, Ben, for saying this, but I'm also relying on other people, of course. I don't know how much you want to know about the paper, but it was actually based on my MA thesis, which the fieldwork for which I did in about 2009, 2010. And I updated it just before the piece came out. It took something like 7 to 8 years to finally appear. That was my first publication. It's all kind of based on something I did for the MA thesis. I did a PhD afterwards in anthropology at Boston University. I'm originally from Germany. I did the PhD in Boston at BU with a topic also on popular religion, but closer to kind of a local voluntary association in Taipei. They perform essentially Baekwan music. This is the music you hear at temple festivals. And they also have the two generals, Bai, that are walking in processions. Yeah, and I continued working with Matsu pilgrims. I was more interested in local pilgrimages actually at this point. So I wasn't really looking into big temples. But
we know exactly what you mean in Taiwan. These big processions and this extremely loud music. There was at least one occurrence when I had to interrupt an interview because there was one such parade in the street and it was so noisy we couldn't hear ourselves in the microphone. But there is. It's something that anyone who pays a bit of interest in Taiwan have stumbled into papers about this, about connections between temples and crimes, and the idea that crime gangs in Taiwan could be linked to the CCP or to unification, so to speak, organizations and act in case of armed conflict with China. And yet it is true, Ben, already you talked in my program last year and we been deeper a bit into that, trying to go beyond the surface. And that's why I'm very happy to give here with you guys something a bit more detailed, a bit more nuanced on this topic for anyone who is interested or even anxious about it. There's a book that I read. It's already quite an old book, but it's a classic on the topic. It's Blood Brothers by Bertil Lindner, in which he talks about the connection between politics and crime in East Asia in general. So as an introduction, what can you tell us in general about this connection between criminal gangs and politics in Taiwan nowadays, in modern times?
The background for why you actually have politicians coming to temples, including local politicians who kind of blur the lines between legal and illegal types of businesses. And that's mainly because the KMT came as a government in exile to Taiwan and had to rely on local, local elites to govern through to the local level. They couldn't just, replace everyone with a KMT, official in every place. I mean, there was just not enough people. Plus, you had to kind of get that education in. You had to get enough officials to go through the training programs in order to fill all those positions. But also that I think the KMT didn't really have an interest in this to begin with, because it was much more effective and easy to govern through with the help of existing local elites. And the way the KMT did this was by supporting different factions at different times. And these factions had to have their power base in a local institution. And it's not only temples that served as power bases, but temples were important power bases because of their historical role as community centers in local society. But you also had other types of institutions, newer institutions that the KMT had brought over or created in local, like farmers' associations, for example. And so typically one faction would take hold of one, and then another faction would take hold of another institution, and the KMT could kind of alternate its support between those factions in order to keep a local balance of power. And most of these factions were actually manned by Benseungren, by people who were native Taiwanese, and not so much Waiseungren. So this is kind of a method it's kind of the old Roman playbook of divide and conquer, where you would kind of give access on a selective basis, and you hold the means by which you can grant access to these sources. And that's kind of how much of that evolved, especially since it really opened up all kinds of ways for corrupt practices to take place, because it was not, accountability was not necessarily the most important reason for the KMT for how it actually distributed power in local places. So everything that kind of that helped accumulate power for one faction was pretty much fair game in this situation, because you had to compete locally with one or two other factions.
We've talked a little bit about how temples became these important centers of power. At the time in Taiwan's history, there were periods where there was not strong police oversight. And so strongmen, I suppose, of a kind would emerge in local areas in Taiwan, enforcing some kind of order, but sometimes profiting off of illegal businesses. And there became an incentive to then dominate temples, because it put you in a position of strength in your negotiations against the ruling power that was at the time the KMT. Then after the democratization of Taiwan, as Jacob has written, things changed very interestingly, because no longer was the KMT in power indefinitely. Politicians had to actually win elections. That made the spiritual power of temples in local communities even more important. And politicians had to essentially negotiate even more strongly with the local individuals who controlled these temples to appear in front of the local community, which actually gave gangsters who in certain cases controlled temples more power to essentially protect themselves from scrutiny over their illegal activity.
So this is an interesting thing here, how we talk about the history of how these gangs established political powers through temples, because political power needed temples. Pretty much it became like the nexus. But we talk here a lot about the Kuomintang, the KMT, because they were the ones in charge. But how about today? Is the GPP also involved in this game to a certain level? I mean, surely this is not just one party playing that game, right?
I would say yes, definitely. It's not both. It's not just the KMT as a phenomenon. You will see in central and southern Taiwan's constituencies, districts, which are controlled by the DPP in local areas, where these same kinds of temple politics play out. Maybe the best illustrator of this is the recent death of the head of the Bamboo Union, the Zhulianbang gang in Taiwan, the largest gang in Taiwan, actually historically a Waishengren gang. So historically sort of founded in the north, connected to the sort of the individuals who came across with the KMT in 1949.
Just a
When
little
the head of
parenthesis,
this
just to
gang,
explain the audience that Waishengren is a term for people who came from China with Chiang after the Second World War, as opposed to Beishengren, who are Taiwanese who were already established there centuries before.
exactly. And the Wai Shengren, yes, have typically voted for the KMT. That's who they came across with. That's who they identify with in many cases. When this head of the Bamboo Union gang, the original Wai Shengren gang, passed away last year, and there was a massive funeral, and it was attended by Taiwanese politicians. It was actually attended by Ke Jianming, one of the most prominent DPP politicians, and Wang Jinping, who was Speaker of the Legislative Yuan for the KMT. So you can see just from this act that two of the most powerful politicians from both major parties in Taiwan attended the funeral of the most powerful gang leader in Taiwan. I mean, I personally find this just concerning if you're a Taiwanese to see that. Taiwanese are used to this. But that alone should illustrate this is not just a KMT phenomenon.
On the level of local temples, or I mean, I'm not talking just about rural temples, but also urban temples, and especially Matsu temples. They are politicized one way or another. So when I speak with pilgrims or, we go visit certain temples, people do have an idea where temples kind of align their allegiances typically or their preferences. And that comes down to the governing board of temples. And those kind of, they are pretty much, or for a lot of temples, they used to be a lot stronger in one hand or the other, in one direction or another. So either supportive of the KMT or the DPP typically. A lot of temples kind of try to get away from that open support system, but they still have people who are closely connected with one party or another on these boards. So what might happen is, temples try to kind of balance out people. This is not because temples themselves aren't really actors, but this is temple leadership and people who are vying for positions. They will try to get votes because they get voted into these positions by a local constituency. Um, and it's in the interest of temples to not appear overly biased. That said, it's still relatively clear when temples are political actors that, they kind of tend one way or another. And oftentimes you do have people who do have party affiliation who are on temple boards. There's one kind of famous example of a temple in Xingang in Jiayi so in Jiayi County, just north of Tainan. And that temple used to be quite green in the past, so it used to be heavily supportive of the DPP to the point where the temple actually organized a tour to New York to protest in front of the UN building for Taiwan's inclusion in the UN. And they do have a plaque that is inside temple grounds that says UN for Taiwan. It was donated by Chen Shui-bian. And that was back in I think it was in 2007. I'm not entirely sure, but it was around that time. And that temple leadership actually flipped just a few years after that event, and it's actually pretty clearly blue dominated now by people affiliated with the KMT, and in part it is because of its connection to Dajia Matsu, to Dajia Zhendangong, because it's part of the Matsu Lianyu Hui, which is the main association between Matsu temples that is actually run by one, or the people who are behind one of the biggest Matsu temples in Taiwan. And they are very strongly on the, not necessarily only KMT side, but strongly influenced by China and in a more pro-unification way.
This is very interesting what you are saying, that indeed they tend to change affiliation, because looking also around, this is something that I have observed in some temples. And so that leads me to another topic that I saw in your paper, is that temples and beyond them gangs, since that's the topic, gangs also are very much motivated by self-preservation, which means that political affiliations are more out of interest rather than ideology, and can flip depending on what's happening. So how do you read that in the framework of people worrying about what gangs would do in case of an invasion of China, in case of an invasion by China, well, is it really in their interest to act in such a big conflict?
You raise a very interesting point, Julien, that gangs are interested in self-preservation. And I think that's really important to hold on to when we think about this question that does come up a lot, whether you like it or not. What would gangs do since they are a large or they are a dispersed group, set of armed, in many cases, armed actors throughout Taiwan, who, of course, have, in theory, the capacity to disrupt a war effort. So that the question just will come up in Taiwan right now. My personal view is yes, because gangs are motivated by self-preservation, it creates a very difficult choice for them. If they were to side with an invading force, and that invading force were to fail, the success of an invasion of Taiwan is by no means guaranteed. Every scholar will say that. Then if they were to side with the invading force, they would lose that fundamental element that has allowed them to persist even in Taiwan's democratization era, which is a thin, a very fragile sense of legitimacy or a right to exist within the social fabric of Taiwan. That is to say that for some reason, maybe because of the temple connection, maybe because it's viewed that gangs are just sort of an essential part of Taiwanese society. Taiwanese people in local areas have not fully rejected them. They could turn their backs on the organizations, but they haven't in many cases. If these gangs were to turn towards the CCP during an invasion and that invasion failed, that would be the end of them. So you have to ask, if you're a leader of a gang, would you want to take that risk? Or would you simply wait until the invasion had been decided before throwing your hat in the ring? That was my assumption in the paper that I wrote. So my view is that the gangs would wait until the last minute or until the end and then make a decision. And so they won't play, in my opinion, by and large, across the island, they won't play a decisive role in an invasion, which is a good thing. We should be grateful for that.
I find that very convincing as an argument. There's also, and I think you actually mentioned that in your article as well, that gangs are most likely very well known to the police and to other, actors that are concerned with national security. So they will be monitored in this situation. So which makes it harder for them to act in a sabotaging manner or something like that.
And this is true. I saw that you were both writing this. There is a connection between gangs and community. So they rely partly on what Ben just called legitimacy and what Jacob called a certain reconnaissance. They are publicly known somehow. How would that translate if they were suddenly to take action against the community that they purport to be a part of?
The question can always be, or your support of a local community it can always be framed in two different ways. It's not obviously always right to stand with the ruling government. We could make the argument, of course, that it's better for the community if it came under the rule of the CCP. So there's no, it kind of, I think it comes down to more like which argument is more likely to catch on in the local population. And of course, in Taiwan, you won't win. In German, you would say you won't win a flower pot with the argument of trying to sell the CCP governance in Taiwan. You wouldn't win anything with that. So that's not really a selling point, I think, for gangs to make. When we speak about gangs, I think we should probably, or I would at least like to caution that the type of organization, there's of course a relatively strong organizational format in gangs. But we also shouldn't take the term gangs to mean something completely apart from other forms of social organization in Taiwan. And the cultural logic on which gangs are based recurs in a lot of other formats in wider society. So it's not that gangs are kind of, completely out there, a completely different form of organization than any other that you find in Taiwan. Like gangs are typically based on ideas of brotherhood and loyalty within brotherhood. So these are kind of almost chosen brothers. And that you can find throughout the field of popular religion in Taiwan. So even in the group that I was working with for my dissertation, there's nothing gang-like about them, or not in the sense that, they would be involved in crime or something like that. They would still have the looks of what you could, I mean, you couldn't distinguish them from a gang. So they would be brothers within that organization, and they would refer to their elders. So there's an intense level of hierarchy and, command system, and, who is obliged to whom and who is obedient to whom. You would see people with tattoos, and, it would all be, or mostly be in Taiwanese, Hokkien. Um, but at the same time, they themselves would not consider themselves a gang of any in any meaningful way. So, and I wouldn't refer to them as a gang either, even though the the logics on which their organization is based is pretty similar. And then under different circumstances, this could turn into a gang relatively easily. So you kind of have to look at, when does a gang become a gang? What distinguishes it from other forms of social organization specifically? I don't know if there's a way out of being a gang, and if you kind of go completely legal and kind of cease to have this more tight-knit structure. But once it's in place, it's probably harder to get to dissolve that kind of structure. But it will be. There are other forms of association that are in Taiwanese society that kind of build on the same kinds of logics.
Yeah, that's very interesting. This is also something I observed in your paper, because you mentioned that the file and rank of these gangs or organizations, however we call them, are sometimes very young people as well. So you question the ability for such young boys to perform what amounts to acts of war, like pretty much like, yes, they can rough up somebody who owes a debt, but that's an entirely different beast than going to commit an attack on a police or military installation. That's something that I saw in your paper, right?
Yes. When we talk about gangs that are gangs, as Jacob has clarified, when we talk about gangs that really are conducting, illegal activity, especially within the context of gangs that are connected to temples, often teenagers, under 18, legal minors, are the specific targets of recruitment for gang leaders. This is because in Taiwan, are actually a lot weaker penalties for crimes committed by minors. So if a minor commits even a serious crime, sometimes they may see, only a few years in prison. What that does is it creates an incentive system where the older sort of criminal bosses can essentially recruit these individuals and tell them, well, listen, you can do this for us. We'll give you some money. You can sell some drugs. Maybe you can go make that person pay. And if you have to hit them, you can hit them. And if you get caught, you go to prison. I will take care of you. And by the time you're 18, that criminal record will be, eliminated. So you don't need to worry. This is somewhat effective, especially for the teens in Taiwanese society who have been, for some reason or another, essentially disaffected, have lost a connection with their family and their schools. Now, my argument is that these are essentially the rank and file. These are the enforcers of most gang activity. And so they are the ones that are going around essentially using force on behalf of the older individuals. And they're the ones that make gangs scary. Now, when you talk about how a gang could essentially side with the CCP, it's often under a scenario where they pick up guns and they start attacking military bases, police stations. They start attacking their own community. If you're really trying to tie this to the structure of Taiwanese gangs, you're talking about legal minors, many of whom have not used guns, who have not killed people. You're asking them to suddenly turn into very dangerous soldiers, militia. Especially when you tie it in with the incentive for these minors, which is to commit petty crimes or any kind of crime without much risk of serious penalty. You're suddenly asking them to do something that is extremely serious, as serious as it gets. You will either die or you will go to prison if this fails. And so it's just simply a far different question. And I doubt what I'm trying to cast suspicion on is whether these young individuals could really be used throughout Taiwan as this kind of militia force, or whether in the event of, a war, they would simply sort of sit it out as, minors, as, young kids tend to do during wars. They're often not really involved.
This is all kind of very hypothetical, and it also depends on actually how much gangs are still pretty independent operators, and I think they will be opportunists in this situation. So I don't think that, a lot of gangs will be under direct control of the CCP. That's pretty hard to say.
And you mentioned also, and I believe you can explain us more, there are also different levels of gangs. You talked about the Bamboo Union, which is a very big criminal organization involved in big operations such as drugs. And then there are smaller organizations working in casinos or brothels, which is another level of crime entirely. Can you tell us more about the distinction between different levels of criminal activities?
Sure, you have these higher echelons of what are now sort of international gangs, like the Bamboo Union has presence throughout East Asia, Southeast Asia. A lot of their business is involving trade in smuggling, in particular smuggling of drugs, of guns, of people, and scams. So these are international crimes, and they occur either in other countries, if you're talking about scams, or they occur at the sort of ports, the infrastructure of Taiwan. So these international sort of higher echelon Bamboo Union, because of this, no longer necessarily have to keep up a strong community relationship, which is why you see Bamboo Union leaders throwing these elaborate parties inside of Taipei with women and fast cars that piss off Taiwanese people because journalists show up and take pictures of it. So these are different from the sort of local gangs which are run by the gatao, the kind of classic sort of local boss. And these are gangs which are sort of more dispersed throughout Taiwan at the individual level, and they may work with the international gangs, they may sell drugs, but they also take part in crimes which really involve the control of territory, like running a gambling den or a brothel. And so, because of this, they need to keep community relations because you're actually operating a business, in a building inside of a local town. People know what's happening in that building. They live in that town. So they need to have some level of support for you or protection. And so what I'm trying to argue is especially these kinds of gangs and gangsters will be very sensitive to, say, disrupting Taiwanese society in a war effort because my expectation is Taiwanese society will experience a level of unity, rally around the flag effect if they are attacked. That's observed everywhere throughout the world. And in that instance, there'll be a strong level of incentive for these local gangs in particular not to disrupt. So that's where the sort of higher and lower levels is important here.
On a horizontal level, some actors are operating from within society and some are operating from kind of a position that is somewhat outside of local society. And this is entirely a different perspective on what Ben was just saying. But so while you have those higher echelons like the Julian Bang, they are entirely operating outside of direct connections with local society. Other groups really have to be enmeshed in local society. And the cases where you actually see a successful negotiation between the two, or where you kind of see people exceeding their local influence and building it into a national type level influence, like Yan Xinbiao, those are people who really manage to operate both of them. And this is not a lot of people. It's in specific structurally advantageous positions and by positioning themselves in a way that kind of makes it possible to reach that level, but at the same time, they cannot forsake their connection with local society. So even Yan Xinbiao, who is the poster child for kind of this type of religious influence, or gang association while also running a temple and that kind of things. He really depends on his local power base in society. And for a long time, he could pretty much take it for granted to the extent that, he could just pass things on to his son while running the temple only, and the son would kind of run the political stuff. But you can only run it so and so much. And just coincidentally, Yan Qingbiao's or the Yan Guanheng's wedding was also attended by all these, also by Wang Jinping and Ma Ying-jeou and people like that. So they have this level of reach to include major national level politicians in their operations, so which legitimizes them. This is kind of what I'm arguing in that paper I wrote at the time. There's a form of spiritual capital, essentially. But it really crucially, it depends on making this claim that, you can represent local society. And once you start kind of operating or going against it too much, it is possible to lose that. You have to negotiate those factors. It's not a given, that power. And it really depends on having a, a reasonable claim to actually representing local interests.
So there is one last thing I want to ask is trying to play a bit the devil's advocate here, and to mention the possibility that there are connections already between gangs and the CCP as of today. You mentioned an example yourself in your paper. You mentioned the White Wolf, who is notorious for his support of the CCP and affiliated gangs who are apparently closely linked to China already and who can potentially be active in subversive activities. So can you tell us more about that?
I have no doubt about that case, that in many instances, certain gangs are doing influence work on behalf of the CCP. They've been integrated into the system in one way or another. There's two ways, actually. My point has always been that gangs work with the CCP in many cases, but I have skepticism that they necessarily might work with them on the military side, on serving as a sort of fifth column. The two ways that they work with the gangs, and the CCP works with the gangs, are simple cases of sort of co-opting an individual like the White Wolf. A simple case of, so it's suspected, essentially setting up an incentive system where the White Wolf has a business in China that seems to do quite well. And there was a good reporting on this by Katrina Northrup in the Washington Post. A large business that sells motorcycle helmets throughout the world. It's apparently the largest producer of motorcycle helmets. That is owned by the White Wolf, who is strongly connected with the Bamboo Union. He helped really build it to what it was before he went international. He was incarcerated in the United States for 10 years. Then he lived in exile in China for over a decade. At that point, he set up that business. And then he returned to Taiwan in 2013 or 2014, whereupon he overtly carries out influence activity, distributing money, essentially forming a political party in Taiwan that is in the process of being disbanded because it doesn't actually seek it doesn't seek any seats or being elected. It simply advocates in favor of unification. Individuals from that political party have attacked protesters who are protesting, say, CCP influence, etc. He shouldn't be discounted, even though he's so overt. He does have a lot of influence because he has a lot of money, and he distributes it in the local level in Taiwan. That's important. The other area is something that Jacob and I have studied, and Jacob has really pioneered, which is understanding how the CCP is leveraging the spiritual power of temples. And that actually taps into the heart of Benshanren society, local society in central and southern Taiwan, which is heavily connected to local temples. And it's tapped into one of the strongest sort of networks of these temples, which Jacob mentioned, the Taiwan Mazu Fellowship, the Mazu Lian Yihui, which is essentially a network founded by arguably the most politically powerful temple inside of Taiwan. Now, what the CCP has been able to do is essentially bring this network of temples into a system of religious exchanges, which come to China and allow essentially at discounted rates or cheap rates Taiwanese to visit temple sites inside of China, especially the birthplace of Mazu, and receive a sort of essentially a grand welcome. It also allows them to connect these leaders of the temples to Chinese business. So some of the leaders of the Zhenlan Temple, including Zheng Mingquan, the vice chair, have businesses in China, which are supported by these exchanges. So they now have a financial incentive to support sort of China-friendly stance inside Taiwan where they're powerful. So those are the two ways, the temple route and then the straight kind of co-opting an individual like the White Wolf.
I'm actually planning to look into this more in the future. But so what you see in Taiwan now, when you go to temple festivals, when you talk to people, when, anything that has to do with popular religion, is very different. And the same actors that are acting in Taiwan will look very differently from what is happening when you're in China. And the same actors going to China. And I was actually in Meizhou and kind of the alleged birthplace of the goddess Mazu, where with Taiwanese money, it was actually mostly Taiwanese money, has been built a huge temple complex that covers it covers a large part of the island. And it's also where the UNESCO intangible cultural heritage of the Matsu belief and customs, I think it's called, is located locally, at least. That's kind of the claim that the CCP is trying to make, that, Matsu is really located in Meizhou Dao. It's ours. And, whatever is happening in Taiwan, if you want to charge up your local Matsus, because there's a hierarchy involved, as a temple, you kind of have to go to a higher temple to benefit from that incense power of that higher temple. And so in that hierarchy, if you make a sensible claim that the highest temple is in China, then, that's why Taiwanese temples feel the need to go to China to charge that incense power, especially temples that are interested in upsetting the hierarchy, the existing hierarchy among temples in Taiwan. When you're in Meizhou and you participate in these events, this is entirely politicized and co-opted by the CCP. And whoever comes from the Taiwanese side kind of has to play within that playbook. So what you typically have is there will be, at least when I went, which is by now is a few years ago, so that was mostly in 2016, you'll have veterans from the Chinese Civil War who kind of visit and come back, and they kind of, they become heroes of the future unification of the two sides and things like that. And the entire setup, whatever this stands for politically, looks entirely differently in China than it does in Taiwan. Like most young people who go on pilgrimages have no interest in being unified. Actually, many of the people I spoke to don't really have an interest in going to China either and visiting. And if they do, it might be a one-time visit, just, out of curiosity. It's no longer this whole thing where you have to go back to the mother country time and time again. But in China, it's still whatever temples are organizing serves actually very different interests. And this is what Ben outlined. This is, the business and vested political interests that elites have in China. What becomes really interesting is if they actually will manage or not to incentivize young Taiwanese to use these routes in order to go to China more regularly and perhaps even to look for work. And that's connected to the economic situation in Taiwan. If, especially on the countryside, for local people on the countryside, local youngsters, if there is no perspective, does going to China actually offer something, and will this create new links? Albeit, I think this timeline we might not actually see that playing out fully, because the timeline for war seems to kind of be exaggerated, and I don't know if the CCP wants to wait for these longer term developments to actually take place. So I'm curious to see what that looks like, but that's something that I would actually look into in the future, I think.
Jacob and Ben, thank you so much for being with us today, and thank you so much for this dive into the temples and the organized crime in Taiwan.
Thank you, Julian. It's been a pleasure.
The Honolulu Defense Forum just concluded in the Hawaiian capital. Between January 11 and 13, it gathered an array of defense and technology leaders along with representatives of various like-minded countries in the Pacific region. The event is of course relevant to Taiwan's security, so let's talk to someone who took part.
I'm Pete Olive. I'm a retired Commodore from the UK's Royal Navy, and I'm a Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, in London, and a Senior Fellow at the think tank Pacific Forum in Honolulu. Over the last week, they've hosted the Honolulu Defense Forum, and this is a conference that's hosted by Pacific Forum, a think tank based in Hawaii. And it's a conference that's been looking at deterrence and preparations for crises in the Indo-Pacific.
Jakub Janda is the Executive Director of the European Values Center for Security Policy, and he was also present at the Honolulu Defense Forum.
There is an annual conference called Honolulu Defense Forum, which is very much about talking about defense of the Indo-Pacific. It's led by the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, the U.S. military, but with very high-level presence from Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Australia, all the key U.S. allies. Yesterday, we saw the defense minister of Japan actually talking here at the Honolulu Defense Forum as well, talking about the, let's say, historical legacy and all the important U.S.-Japan alliance in this context. So it's very much kind of a prime defense forum for the Indo-Pacific on the American side. I mean, some of our friends here call it the Shangri-La dialogue without the Chinese. So basically allies talking to each other primarily here in Honolulu. So that's essentially what's happening here over a couple of days.
So this is the third year that they've held the conference. And it's different in many ways from other security conferences in the region because it's very much dominated by headquarters US Indo-PACOM in terms of the attendees. The commander himself spoke several times, but all of his subordinate commanders and many other from the US military and partner military. But it also had many from industry, from defense industry, defense innovators, and from technology areas, and academics working in the field. And the idea is to bring them all together to generate new ideas about how to accelerate deterrence and sort of prepare for sort of worst case scenarios, but also avoid them.
So this event actually started roughly 3 years ago. It's been spearheaded by the Pacific Forum, a think tank based here in Honolulu, which has been partnering with multiple think tanks globally, including my own European Value Center. So roughly 3 years ago, it started more or less as a forum for discussions between U.S. military and U.S. defense industry leaders about how they need to work together to potentially mobilize defense industry in potential conflict in the Pacific. And it has evolved into also a major policy conference where not only basically the Americans talk to each other, but they involve all the key allies, where essentially Japan, Taiwan, and Korea and the Philippines are the key drivers. So they have high-level presence. Usually the top military commanders are coming here for this, and it's quite often defense ministers or defense officials from these countries as well.
Both Jakub and Peter shared their opinion on the meaning of the annual event.
I would essentially say it's essentially team building in that case, which might sound strange, but if I could compare it as a European person, so in Europe we have a lot of NATO conversations of this kind, but as we all know, in Asia or in the Pacific, United States only have bilateral treaty allies, so essentially US to Korea, US to Japan, and so on. But there is no multilateral defense organization like NATO is in Europe. And for that, you actually need multilateral discussions, not only discussions, but also standardization of equipment, for example, of defense acquisition. So essentially a lot of, in a nutshell, bureaucratic things, procedural items, which are very much needed if you want to potentially fight as an alliance and not only as a group of bilateral allies. And to my understanding, this is essentially what this conference is all about. And this is the whole effort by the US Indo-Pacific Command, is to actually lay this ground or use this ground for what I would call more coordinated allied actions, which is not only bilateral between US and individual allies in the Pacific.
Well, I think, having this is the second one I've attended. So from last year to this, just how much has been done in terms of preparing, building military forces, investing in new technologies, developing new partnerships. So there's clearly a huge amount has been done very rapidly to operationalize urgency, I think is the term they're using. Firstly, how much progress has been made, but also the sort of determination to bring together, all the kind of people you need to have in the room to try and solve problems. There's a tendency with these things to be stovepipes. The military, don't necessarily talk as much as they should to the tech innovators, the industry, the academics. But the whole idea of the conference is, the best ideas can be generated if you get people from different backgrounds together to share ideas and come up with new approaches. So very impressive from that perspective.
I believe this event is basically a tool or a platform for what is called Piper, and it's a U.S. Department of Defense or Department of War initiative, which aims to basically create standardization across defense industries of these American allies in the Pacific. Something what again we already have in NATO for decades, but here it has not been present. So it's all about let's say streamlining or coordinating the procedures on the defense acquisitions or standardizations of, for example, ammunitions or communications infrastructure. So in that case, I believe this forum has been quite helpful to it because they have not only defense officials like military leaders, but also mainly the defense industry talking to them over here, which is quite often happening, but only inside of the United States or inside of NATO. But with these kind of multilateral partners or key US allies, this has not been happening significantly. Also because historically, for example, the Koreans did not really want to talk to the Japanese and so on. But these difficulties seem to be over, so they could basically be talking about a very sensitive subject under one roof. So that's apparently what's happening here.
They both cited the appearance of Japanese Defense Minister Shinjiro Koizumi as a highlight this year.
Honestly, the highlight to me was actually the speech of the Defense Minister of Japan. He obviously discussed the alliance, but with the US and with others. But the other thing which I think is quite significant is that the Japanese Defense Minister actually attended various ceremonies here in Honolulu at the Pearl Harbor Memorial, for example, which is actually very significant given that all the casualties which still lay around here in Hawaii, and essentially, it's obviously not like an apology from Japan because that was basically like a relatively regular war between the US and Japan back then, but in some sorts, it's actually very symbolic that you could see countries which effectively fought each other in a total war between Japan and US back then, and now they are actually Japan is the closest ally of the US in Asia. So at every level and in every government. So that's to me what's significant.
Well, he spoke at the conference, yes, and he was a very sort of forthright and forthcoming. But no, he was very good, and there was also the president of Palau spoke. Very movingly, actually, because Palau is one of the countries that is, small Pacific islands that is resisting the pressures that China is placing on many of those countries. And he spoke very movingly about the pressures they've been put under, but also how they're sort of resisting them.
And of course, Taiwan was central to the conversation.
You could infer that the thing that we're deterring in this conference, if you like, is that sort of worst case scenario of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. That was sort of implicit, I guess, about the whole conversation across the 2 days. But there were a couple of panels as well, sort of dedicated to, specifically to Taiwan and the situation it's facing. I think what Taiwan should take from it is there's a lot of focus from international partners. It used to be that, of course, it was, the US primarily who are the ones focused on this, but the number of countries who are clearly engaged and interested and seeking to support Taiwan is growing. So I think that is something Taiwan should take as, an important sign. But also, I think the sort of approach that was taken, that sort of bringing together military, academic, defense, tech innovators, and getting them all in the room to thrash around ideas is a really good approach, and something Taiwan should consider as well.
On other news around Taiwan and the world, the US and Taiwan have agreed a new trade deal that lowers US tariffs on Taiwanese goods from 20 to 15%. It ties it to at least a $250 billion in new Taiwanese investment in US semiconductors, AI, and energy production. The deal is framed by Washington as strengthening supply chain resilience and deepening Taiwan's role as a strategic tech partner. Also, Taiwan's Vice Defense Minister Hu Shu-xian said there are 4 additional US arms deals still waiting to be formally notified to Congress. He didn't give details, but this comes as President Lai Ching-te pushes an extra $40 billion in defense spending through 2033. This follows last month's record $11 billion arm package. We will meet again next week for a new episode of Taiwan versus the World.